inequity, is it a systemic problem? Or is it a problem of a model within a system? Or is it a question of practice? I want to walk you through, very briefly, through the history of Kenya. The first 1.5 decades, Kenya had the highest growth so far. We have not been able to replicate that. But it is during the same time that there was massive investment in basic social services. It is during the same time when all these interventions that conventional economists are telling us are wrong were in place. There was a very big state sector. There was import substitution. There was almost everything we are being told is inimical to growth. Then the 1.5 decades after that, we dismantled everything. And just to correct you, actually we didn't introduce free primary school here in 2003. Free primary education was introduced in 1974 and abolished in 1989. But when the liberalization and deregulation that came with structural adjustment programs set in, almost everything went down, including growth. So we've been asking ourselves, was it really worth it? Now we are being told, okay, there were serious mistakes with the implementation of the adjustment programs and so on. And therefore now emphasis is on regulation and so on. But we are still not seeing the ordinary person, the one Atieno was talking about that walks from Kibera to industrial area to look for a job they're not sure they'll get. Their situation is not changing. So I just want to ask any of you that feels sufficiently inspired to try and answer that. Thank you.
I really wish to be very brief, and my worry at this point, how are we going to demonstrate that we can have imagination of an economy that can work? Because for sure this one does not work, because we are all very much integrated to the money economy, which doesn't balance with the service access, like it has already been stated here. And words like equality, in order to get equality, these are things we have talked for so long, poverty so long, but we really do know that these issues are very, very systemic. I would really wish that you help us to state where is the problem systematically in the system and what do we need to do with it, so that we can be able to open the human potential that is very, very excluded. And that is what is actually the economy of a country like Kenya, the so-called informal economy versus the formal economy. GDP versus what people produce, and it's never put into that GDP.
I think it's the issue of the inequalities that you find in this continent. We've really talked about them, they're deplorable. And I think the fact that Kenya has the biggest slum in this continent, for me, is completely unacceptable. However, I do celebrate the fact that Kenya's budget has actually very minimal support from donors. I think that's very good. However, one thing that I think contributes to this conversation regarding that is the issue of how resources in this country are prioritized and are appropriated. And I think the issue that Atieno raised of the minimal citizen participation is a key thing. And I think part of the challenge with that is that the institutions that are intended to support citizens engaged in these conversations are compromised and have limited impact. For me, the challenge with the multipartyism in this country, there is a silliness of multipartyism But in terms of following what is going on, you actually see that people follow more political individuals. You do not necessarily see people having a commitment towards a political party, its ideology and programs, and sticking with that, and using that as a way of influencing who's making decisions. And the second one, for me, I have a challenge with the media in this country. You have multiple voices of media in this country, but you can see that they're very partisan in terms of how they engage. And so that's also another challenge, because if we're good media that is doing good investigative journalism, you'll have a lot of the things that are around the decision making towards how resources are appropriated in this country revealed to citizens, and then citizens engaging in a more effective way. And then also I think civic society in this country is very good and has been engaging, but there's a need to continuously grow that. So that with these three institutions, I think working effectively, you would see a lot more citizen engagement and influence in how decisions are made around resource appropriation. Thank you.
So lots of interesting questions there. First of all, I want to stress that when I was saying growth was necessary, I was not meaning to imply that it was sufficient. Okay, growth by itself is not sufficient. There's clearly got to be attention paid to how growth is distributed and who can participate in the market economy that is able to generate the growth. That almost goes, from my perspective, without saying. I'm very aware that Brazil recently has achieved both growth with equity, with improving equity. And I was actually talking about China when I was, and the early part of China's growth, when it was moving from very equal to a less equal society. And I'm very happy, by the way, that the Chinese leadership is concerned about equity, because I think every government ought to be concerned about equity. And there are many governments in the world, including rich ones, that aren't sufficiently concerned about equity, in my view, including the United States. Brazil is a good example of a government that has made a concerted effort to improve equity by focusing on precisely some of the things that those of you in the audience and some of us on the panel have also mentioned. Very strong investment in education to provide more equality of opportunity, even if there isn't necessarily relative equality of income. And then also a very large and successful cash transfer program called Bolsa Familia. Many of you have probably heard of this, which has directly raised the income level of the poorest parts of the population, closing the gap between where they were and the poverty line, lifting them up above the poverty line. That's obviously had a tremendous impact in Brazil. And this is also something that needs to happen in Kenya. In Kenya, in my view, there has been a pretty strong focus on growth historically, not at all enough attention paid to how that growth is distributed across the country. And a very large part of the dialogue that the donor community has with government is about precisely that issue. How do we get more equity out of the growth that we're generating? Both how do we get the growth, but also how do we get more equity out of it? And I completely agree with Ocheno when she says that the donors still do have a lot of soft power. We don't put a lot of money into the system, although the little bits that we put in do tend to get concentrated in the development side of the budget of some of the key sectors, such as education and healthcare. And if donor money were pulled out of this country entirely, after a few years you would notice the impact, because the development budgets in those sectors where donors are heavily represented would diminish quite significantly. And the reason, by the way, we're concentrated in those sectors is precisely because we're trying to improve equity. The World Bank right now is working with the government on consolidating its various social safety nets into a single program with a single registry, a private sector payment provider, a consolidated monitoring and information system, so that we can move closer to something like the Bolsa Familia over time and reach out to those populations in the arid and semi-arid lands who are clearly the most disadvantaged people in this country to help lift them out of poverty. Similarly, infrastructure investments, at least the World Bank infrastructure investments, many of them are now focusing on parts of the country that have historically been disadvantaged. We've done a lot of work, and you may have seen some of this, to show how infrastructure investments over the last 30 years have been distributed across Kenya and how certain regions in Kenya have been favored while others have been disfavored, and the unequal access to those infrastructure services that have resulted. And so we have made a very conscious effort in our program, and a lot of donors are doing the same thing, to try to correct those inequalities. There were some comments also about youth employment, and I completely agree. I mean, we do very much have to focus on youth. It's an extremely important constituency in any country. And again, we're working actually very closely in this case with the Kenya Private Sector Alliance to try to understand better how youth can transition from education into the job market. I guess I want to come back for a few seconds to devolution. There was a question about what we think of the current formula. The current formula is not perfect, but it does have the very strong advantage of being easy to understand. And in this country, at this point in its history, having transparency in how that formula is going to be applied is critically important, given the lack of trust that exists between the citizens and government and concerns about corruption. It already is quite strongly redistributive, maybe not as much as it needs to be over time, but our principal concern at this point is that the counties that will be getting, some of which will be getting very, very much larger amounts of resources than they have in the past, will they actually be able to absorb those resources and use them in ways that will actually reduce poverty? A lot of people forget that it's not simply a matter of putting the money at the county government level. You also have to have capacity at the county government level, institutional capacity, to use that money in the way that it needs to be used. And we're very concerned about how far away we are from that threshold in some areas. And then finally, I just want to say a few things about urban areas versus rural areas. Our expectation is that the devolution will result in more expenditure in the rural areas, and that's probably in general a good thing, but there's also a very large risk in this country that urban areas, particularly in those counties which are not majority urban, and there's only 3 counties that are majority urban, okay, Mombasa, Nairobi obviously, and Kisumu. Every other county is minority urban when you look at the population. Our concern is that county councillors, county assemblies will overinvest in rural areas to the detriment of the urban areas, which increasingly in the modern world are the source of economic growth. And there is a real danger that the local growth poles within the counties like Nakuru, will be weakened because of insufficient resources to maintain urban infrastructure needed to allow businesses to grow. Finally, there were some questions about, or some comments about, GDP growth and whether that is an appropriate measure. And I think that our view increasingly in the World Bank is that it's a very important measure, but it needs to be supplemented with all sorts of other considerations. We are currently leading an effort or involved in an effort to promote what we're calling green national accounting, trying to understand how sustainable the GDP growth that countries are achieving actually is, how much of a drawdown on the environment it requires to maintain it. But I know there are other efforts underway as well to take a more inclusive view, looking not only at natural wealth, which is what I was talking about a moment ago, but also at manufactured wealth, and how growth over time within economies involves differential growth with GDP, natural wealth, and manufactured wealth over time, and what that means for the future of those countries. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.